The world debates a single question. It fights wars over it, writes laws about it, and screams in protest over it. When does a human life actually begin? Is it the first heartbeat? Is it the first brainwave? Is it that first desperate gasp of air outside the womb? In a modern world defined by gray areas and shifting opinions, one of the oldest institutions on earth, the Catholic Church, has an answer. And it is not a vague suggestion. It is definitive, it is consistent, and it has held firm for 2,000 years. But here is the catch. This isn't just an abstract theological idea meant for dusty books. This teaching has massive, earth-shattering implications for how we define rights, how we write laws, and how we treat every single person we meet. To understand this, we have to peel back the layers. We need to trace the theological and scientific reasoning that underpins an unwavering stance, that life is sacred and begins at conception. So, let's go deep. Let's look at the science, the history, and the philosophy to understand why the Church claims that you were you from the very first specific millisecond of your existence. First, we have to look at the foundation. Where does this audacity come from? This isn't the opinion of one man in a white robe. It is a massive, accumulated body of teaching. If you open the Catechism of the Catholic Church, essentially the master code of the faith, you find paragraph 2270. It doesn't mince words. It says, human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. It demands that from the first spark of existence, a human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person. That is the bedrock. But it goes deeper. You have the weight of papal encyclicals. Think of these as the Supreme Court decisions of the Church. In 1990, Pope John Paul II wrote Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. He wasn't just writing a letter. He was fighting a war against what he called a culture of death. He argued that we must build a culture of life that respects every human being. Then you have the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. These are the guardians of doctrine. In documents like Donum Vitae, the gift of life, they took ancient principles and applied them to modern sci-fi realities, like in vitro fertilization. They concluded that an embryo in a lab isn't just biological material. It is a human life demanding respect. So, you have the Catechism, the popes, and the doctrinal guardians all pointing to one specific moment: conception. Now, strip away the theology for a second. Let's look at the biology. The Church's teaching isn't fighting science. It is actually betting the house on it. Before conception, you have a sperm and an egg. Biologically, these are human parts. They are alive, yes, but they are not organisms. A sperm is part of the father. An egg is part of the mother. They contain only half the code. But then the fusion happens. Fertilization. In that fraction of a second, those two distinct entities cease to exist, and something entirely new bursts onto the scene. The zygote. This isn't just a fertilized egg. It is a radical new reality. Science tells us three undeniable things about this single cell. First, it is human. It carries a DNA code that has never existed before in the history of the universe and will never exist again. It is distinct from the mother and distinct from the father. It has its own eye color, its own blood type, its own blueprint. Second, it is alive. It metabolizes energy. It reacts. It grows. And third, and most importantly, it is an organism. It is not a kidney cell or a skin cell. It is a whole, integrated being that drives its own development. If you leave a skin cell alone, it dies. If you leave a zygote alone in a nurturing environment, it builds a brain, a heart, and a spine. It isn't potential life. It is a life with potential. The Church looks at this biology and says, that is a person. But the Church adds a dimension that biology can't touch: the soul. The Church teaches that we are a composite, a mix of physical body and spiritual soul. And here is the crucial claim: the soul isn't added later. It isn't downloaded when the brain turns on. The Church teaches that God creates the immortal soul immediately at the moment of conception. Body and soul are woven together in that first instant. This means there is no such thing as a pre-human biological blob that eventually earns personhood. You don't become a person. You are a person. The ultimate proof for a Catholic? The Incarnation. They believe that when God became man in the womb of Mary, he didn't wait to become a person. He was fully divine and fully human from the moment of conception. So if this microscopic dot is a person, what do we owe it? This brings us to the most radical principle in Catholic social teaching: inherent human dignity. This dignity is not a prize you win. It's not something the government grants you. It is inherent. It is built in. It comes from being made in the image of God. And because it is inherent, it cannot be lost. It doesn't matter if you are rich or poor, sick or healthy, born or unborn. To explain this, ethicists use an acronym: SLED. It stands for size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. Let's break it down. Size. Does being small make you less human? A newborn is smaller than an NBA player, but they have equal rights. An embryo is tiny, but size is not a measure of level of development. A toddler is less developed than a teenager. Does the toddler have less right to live? Of course not. The embryo is just at the earliest stage of the same human journey. This is the big one. Does your location define your humanity? If you walk from the kitchen to the living room, you don't change species. So why does moving from the womb to the outside world change who you are? The Church argues it doesn't. Degree of dependency. This is the most uncomfortable one. Yes, the unborn is totally dependent on the mother, but so is a newborn. So is a patient on dialysis. Dependency doesn't negate humanity, it just highlights our fragility. Now, you might hear a counter-argument. You might hear that the Church invented this idea in 1869. That is a myth, but it's based on a historical misunderstanding. It is true that for centuries, theologians like Aquinas relied on Aristotle's bad biology. They thought the soul came later, after the body was formed. But, and this is critical, they still believed abortion was a grave sin. They always viewed it as attacking a life designed by God. The moral stance was constant. Only the biological understanding was flawed. Then came the 19th century. Science discovered the human egg. We learned about genetics. We realized Aristotle was wrong. There was no delayed formation. The complexity was there from the start. So in 1869, Pope Pius IX didn't change the morality. He updated the law to match the new science. He removed the distinction between early and late abortion penalties because science proved it was the same human life the whole time. Science didn't debunk the Church, it vindicated it. So what happens when you take this teaching seriously? It creates what is called the consistent ethic of life. This is the seamless garment. If life begins at conception, then abortion is the direct killing of an innocent human person. The Church calls it a moral evil. Pope Francis has been blunt, comparing it to hiring a hitman. But the logic doesn't stop there. It extends to IVF, where embryos are often created, frozen, or discarded. The Church asks, if those are human lives, how can we freeze them? And it goes further. If life is sacred from conception, it is sacred until natural death. This is why the Church opposes euthanasia. It is why it opposes the death penalty. It is why it demands care for the immigrant, the poor, and the marginalized. You cannot claim to be pro-life in the womb and ignore the suffering of the person on the street. It is an all-or-nothing proposition. This is the Catholic view. It is rigorous, it is demanding, and it is uncompromising. It argues that a unique, unrepeatable human story begins not at birth, but in the quiet, microscopic explosion of conception. It demands that we look at a single cell and see a neighbor, a brother, a sister, a person with an infinite destiny. And it asks us to build a world that welcomes them.